Welcome, everybody. So, I did have a few from Dr. Kaplan again.
I love you. I love you.
And some of his stuff, even for HBSC, the lifespan development, was a big deal. But his explanation of groups, because he did write the group book, is pretty big. So, group counseling in general. He did 12 total videos, so if you look them
Hi
up.
everyone, my name is Dr. Daniel Kaplan and welcome to my channel. I'm a clinical psychologist and I've been a professor for over 15 years now here in New York City. What you're going to find on my channel are videos related to clinical psychology, psychotherapy, personality theory, human development, research methods, and so much more. Hit the subscribe button if you're looking to take your knowledge about psychology to the next level, because I design every video with intent that you could take something away from it. I'm super excited to have you here, and I look forward to you coming on this journey with me.
So he got the working stage and the termination
The
stage.
initial stage is to establish trust. So that's the work that's of group. We talked about the initial stage. We talked about the transition stage. The most immediate video I did before this, we talked about group dynamics and factors that are at play. Now let's talk about the working stage, which is the third of the four stages. All right, so let's start with our learning objectives. So the first learning objective is to appreciate the dynamics associated with group process and development, demonstrate some leader interventions for exploring fear at various stages of group. We'll identify key characteristics of the group during the working stage. We'll distinguish the difference between a working group versus a non-working group. We'll identify ethical and cultural relevant strategies for designing and facilitating groups. And then we'll continue with a discussion of choices that are made during the working stage, therapeutic factors that are at play and how they impact group effectiveness. We'll talk about self-disclosure from the member, self-disclosure from the leader, guidelines for giving and receiving feedback. And I talked about this briefly in an earlier lecture, the importance of compassionate criticism. And then we'll talk about identity, to identify issues with co-leaders during the working stage. So one thing that is important to start off with in principle is we talk about these four stages, but there's no arbitrary line between each phase. And when we talk about phases or stages, there has to be a transformative
Souls that happen at the
shift that
unit
happens in order to move from one stage to another, right? And some groups will make it to the working stage. Some groups may not reach the working stage, right? And the development of the group as a whole tends to ebb and flow, right? So it's dynamic, it's not static, it doesn't stay the same. So as I said earlier, work happens at every stage, not just the working stage. So I don't want you to think that working stage means now we're doing work. Remember when we talked about the goals of each stage, the goal of the initial stage is to establish trust. So that's the work that's being done. The transition stage is addressing risk taking and the initial stages of conflict, right? So each stage has its own function, but not every group reaches the working stage, as I said. And even if the group as a whole is in a working stage, not every individual is at the same point at the same time. So we have to understand their individual differences even when the group moves. So you have to be mindful where the group is and where the individual is. All right. But to reach the working stage, members must make a commitment to work through challenges and face issues and barriers that are interfering with the group's progress. So there has to be an openness for change. There has to be a willingness to receive criticism and work on any resistance or unwritten, agendas that a person has or hidden agendas that a person has. So it's important to commit that you're going to look at those. And I said work happens at every stage, but there is a deeper exploration of the self, deeper exploration of the functioning within the group. And this occurs as a function of the group coming together. So when you have group cohesion, then you could start to look deeper. So that closeness that you have with the other members of the group allows you to feel safe, allows you to receive criticism, and allows you to explore blind spots that you might have on a deeper level. So that's important. So interventions at each stage. One intervention we have at the initial stage is to provide encouragement. When we talk about the transition stage, the interventions demand more from the member than at the initial stage. So now the member has to be self-driven a little more. And then in the working stage, the entire group is working. The entire group is focusing on the member's personal work and vice versa.
The best way to attract high-ticket coaching clients is not to spend all your time and money on social media content.
So you start by getting people to take risks and trust and share. Then they're self-governed. And then the group can put a spotlight on an individual. And last but not least, we encourage members to see how they change as a function of the group, right? So we look for transformation in the final stage. So the group norms and behavior of the working stage, one norm is that we support and challenge members of the group. We encourage people to take risks. In terms of interventions, there's no singular intervention that you do. I will say that the lecture on theories and interventions was helpful because a lot of what we said comes back in this stage. There's definitely more interaction between the members. Members are more direct. Members are starting to challenge one another, and they're starting to focus on action-oriented behavior. All right, so we tend to see in a working group that there's a large amount of trust. That trust is established. Members' goals are clear and specific. They focus on the present. Now they're willing to make themselves known. Now, you may recall in a transition phase, we talked about people taking risks and putting their toe in the water. Now, they're no longer just putting their toe in the water, they're diving headfirst into the water, right? So they're making themselves known. And it came as a function of all the trust and risk-taking activities that occurred prior. Cohesion is close. Everyone feels a bond to one another. Wherever there's conflict, it's identified, recognized, and explored. Remember, we said in a transition stage that conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict can result in closeness, can result in intimacy. So at this point, the members of the group can identify conflict. They can healthily address conflict. They can explore the sources of conflict and so forth. All right. In terms of a non-working group, it's sort of the opposite mirror of it. So instead of having trust, there's mistrust in the group, there's unexpressed feelings, there's a focus more on others than oneself. People tend to hold back, and instead of addressing conflict, they're ignored or they're addressed in indirect ways. Now, what's interesting about this is, we said conflict can be a good thing, right? So ignoring conflict or avoiding conflict or trying to communicate or address conflict in indirect ways actually doesn't solve the problem. It creates an opportunity for there to be miscommunication or for people to misinterpret what you're trying to say. So all of these things have to be attended to in the working stage. So we have a choice, right? So there are decisions that people are making as members of the group. The first one is whether to share or not share, whether to self-disclose or whether to remain anonymous, right? So when people speak up in a group, they're taking a risk. That requires a sense of trust. Whereas people who remain silent, they're keeping their views anonymous. They're not actually giving the group the experience, right? Authenticity versus guardedness, right? So being real and being raw as appropriate, that would be being authentic, versus being guarded would be holding back and not allowing the true self to come out. Being spontaneous versus regulated, right? Being spontaneous, you'll notice in initial stages, the group leader might call upon people, right? But by the working stage, people should just naturally chime in, naturally share, demonstrate a sense of spontaneity. Whereas people might, if they don't feel that there's trust, they might be more regulated or guarded, or I use guarded, but they might control their actions a little more. Acceptance versus rejection. One of the biggest questions in the initial stage is whether or not you're going to be accepted or rejected, right? So at this point, you're making a decision whether you feel part of the group and accepted. If you feel more accepted, you're going to be more likely to participate. If you feel rejected, you're going to be more likely to distance yourself from the group and not take risks. Unity versus fragmentation. Unity or cohesion is absolutely essential for the working stage, right? Versus fragmentation, where people are working on their own agenda versus the collective goals of the group, that would be more fragmentation. All right. Now the group, in terms of homework, we talk about giving homework. The group is not an end of itself. It's actually a place, it's a laboratory. That's the best way to say it. It's a laboratory where you can try things out. You can learn new behaviors, you can learn new sets of skills. It's a training ground, whatever you want to say. But the work should happen in between groups. So if you use homework, you give people an opportunity to connect to what happened in group, between groups, which means that instead of having 60 to 90 minutes with these individuals, now you're giving them the opportunity to think about the experiences of group 24/7. You're giving them the full range of experience. Members can design their or devise their own homework assignments, right? So when we talk about individual goals, within a group setting, if you want to work on something, you say, well, what's one thing you might want to commit to this week? And then members might say, well, my goal is X. This week I'm going to work on Y. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. In terms of what you settle in on, many times the homework is done in a collaborative way, which is not just the member themselves, but the leader is supposed to facilitate that or shape that or change it up if appropriate, or guide the homework process. So the leader also plays a role in helping form homework. In psychoeducational groups, it actually is more often the leader who gives the homework. All right, so in terms of therapeutic factors that operate in a group, we talked about self-disclosure, sharing about oneself. There are different levels of that. That's important, right? So people should share about themselves, offer feedback. So this is other members of the group offering feedback about their experience of another person. Confrontation, and again,
Still, computers already maxed out. I don't know why. I
as
guess
we
it
emphasized
is the
in another
bottom,
lecture.
which is system data. It makes
Finding
no
a
sense.
sense of
300
cohesion or
gigs.
universality, hope, purpose. Now, these are a list you might have remembered you saw in the first lesson as well, but now you're starting to see them really at play and how they actually come. So people might come into a group very depressed and despondent, but as a function of the group process, they might feel more hopefulness, willing to take risks and trust, feeling accepted, feeling more empowered versus disempowered, feeling a catharsis, a release of whatever has been bothering them or plaguing them, working on their thoughts, focusing on a commitment to change, invite an invitation to experiment with who they want to be, not who they were in the past. And humor. Humor is important. I actually use humor all the time in session because I find that there is a natural tension that happens in all therapy processes. So using humor can release some of that tension. All right. So about self-disclosure, whenever you share, it should be related to the purposes of the group. It should help the group move forward. And those of you who've had the experiential point part of the class, you've seen how group leaders can model self-disclosure in an appropriate way to get people talking, right? So self-disclosure is very important because it allows all the thoughts and feelings you're experiencing and that keep recurring to have an outlet, right? So your level of self-disclosure and that which you self-disclose, it depends on many things. Number one, the stage of the group might determine what's appropriate. So it's not uncommon for people to be very authentic in the initial stage, but in the working stage, people are going to share at a deeper level, right? And in terms of what you disclose, no one can make you share something you don't want to share. So what you disclose, how much you disclose is entirely up to you, right? But we know that if people feel safe in a group setting, they're going to be more likely to self-disclose, right? Because they feel that they're not under attack. So when you give feedback, right? So another thing is giving feedback to other people. Give honest feedback, right? So you don't benefit another person by not giving them real feedback. So if you see something in a person that's not okay, you can bring it to their attention, but you should do it with sensitivity. And you may recall in an earlier lesson when you're offering constructive criticism, there were principles at play, right? So make sure those principles are fulfilled. Make sure that the other people know how their behavior affects you right? So speak from your point of view in a non-judgmental way, and try not to offer global feedback like you never do this, you always do that, or overgeneralizations in general are not going to be helpful.
If you're over 40 and you're not dermaplaning, you're making a big mistake. This thing has completely won the battle with facial hair. My skin stays soft and glowing for weeks, and my hair does not grow back.
Catharsis, right? Catharsis is a release or an expression of pent-up emotions, right? So there are times in the group process where people are having an intense moment, and they're adding. You might have two members of the group locking horns, but as a function of sharing their experience, they feel released, they feel healed, right? And as a function of that, they feel closer to the person, even the person they were locking horns with. So you can have a catharsis or release by being authentic, by sharing your emotions, releasing them. Now, be careful with how deeply you dive into emotions, because you have to be able to repackage the experience, right? So maybe that deep emotional experience wouldn't be appropriate for a parenting group, let's say. I don't know. Actually, I can see reasons why it might be appropriate for a parenting group, but there might be settings where that deep expression of emotions, you may not want to go that deep. What happens after the cathartic event? Well, first you want to link the emotions with their thoughts and behavior. So if they had this insight, this incredible self-discovery or release, we ask them, what are you thinking right now? What are you feeling? How might you take this and put it into action when it comes to behavior? So we link the emotions with thoughts and behaviors. And absolutely, it's important to link that catharsis with some kind of behavioral outcome or action plan going forward. When we talk about co-leading a group in a working stage, between group sessions, you're supposed to discuss the reaction to group members, see how each one's interacting with one another, and how you can help participants better understand themselves, better understand their behavior within the group, and resolve some of their conflict, right? So you also use an opportunity to evaluate how the group is going and how it's going as a group co-leader, right? So how are we doing as facilitators? And then, we evaluate orientation styles, self-disclosure, and so forth. You talk about the next step, right, of interventions we might use. Now, the member function. What should members be experiencing at the working stage? Well, they should come into group ready to talk. They should come into group ready to share experiences that they want to bring up or issues that they want to bring up. They should be committed to offering feedback to another person. And if they're receiving feedback, they should be committed to an open-mindedness to whatever feedback they're doing. They should be willing to take risks. They should be willing to practice new skills and interventions in their daily life. And they should be willing to evaluate how they're feeling with the group experience and their relative satisfaction with the group. Now, leader function, your job as the leader is to model appropriate behavior. We've been saying this from the initial stage. Continue to model self-disclosure and appropriate behavior. If people are trying to take risks, you want to support people's willingness to take risks and encourage people to get a little bit beyond their comfort zone. And then if they do take a risk, you want to help them turn it into some action, right? You also want to, there are going to be times when you want to do a deeper dive on a person, further self-exploration, right? So in the event that you see someone is stuck or about to have a catharsis, you might do a deeper sense. You might look for common themes across members of the group to provide some universality. I like to use the phrase, can anyone join this person with this experience? Has anyone had a similar experience, right? And with that, you're identifying universality. And then, you're promoting behaviors that will increase cohesion as a function of decreased cohesion. So that is a very quick rundown of the lesson. So I'm going to stop there. And until next time, everybody.
Okay, so that was
You can get nucleus permanent teeth in 24 hours. Well,
working stage. This is the termination stage.
All right, so I'm going to get started. It's actually bittersweet that this is the last lecture of the group therapy series. So I'm actually feeling some feelings that one might experience at the end of group. So there's some interesting parallel process going on with the lecture, as well as what one might experience in a group that is terminating, that is closing. So, but as with all of the lessons, we start with learning objectives, and we want to understand the group dynamics associated with the group process and development, right? We'll talk about the main leader and member task at the final stage of group. And you may recall, even though we moved away from it, we talked about the initial stage, transition stage, and working stage. Now we're at the final stage, right? And we want to think about the main tasks that the group leader, as well as the members of the group, experience at the end of group. And at this point, we also are thinking about, well, what did we get out of the group, right? So it's very important to think about that. We also want to identify any issues that are important when effectively terminating a group, right? So you want to pay attention to those factors and address them appropriately. We also want to pay attention to feelings of separation. It is a perfectly normal experience to mourn the loss, right? Termination comes with ending a group, so it's not uncommon for people to mourn the loss of the closeness they had with members of the group. We'll talk about various guidelines for saying goodbye in an effective way, strategies to evaluate or review the group experience. We'll talk about how to implement some of the things that you've learned in group, outside of group. So how to generalize from the group setting to the real world, which is something I've mentioned in previous videos and lectures, is that, the group serves as a laboratory to practice and tinker and figure things out. But the goal is to generalize from the group out to the real world. So that's very important to think about, well, how are you going to apply this after group? All right. We'll also talk about important kinds of feedback we're going to give each other, right, at the final stage. And the feedback is multi-directional. It goes from one group member to other group members. The group members are haven't spoken to each individual member, and then all members to the group leader, and then back. So it's multi-dimensional, multi-directional, the feedback we get. And then in terms of how we utilize homework and contracts to help us solidify or consolidate that learning.
That's fucking awesome.
You know,
So,
homework is an
after
interesting
that,
thing
basic,
because
just
homework
the
allows you to take the
Dr.
group experience
Hunt has to get
from
her shit together and
being
tell us how
90
to hire
minutes or
counselors and post up shit.
60 minutes in some cases
They see the
to being a 24/7
students and,
operation. You can actually take that
pre-counseling
exercise
survey
bring
and
it
a
with
post-counseling survey,
at all
and
times.
we kind of analyze those.
We also want to think about
Different
how to
surveys,
handle
And then we'll just try to
setbacks
create
and
classes
relapse
with
prevention.
PRs by next semester.
Right? What happens if you go backwards and you don't have the group to follow, right? And we'll address that. We'll talk about evaluation and co-leader issues at the end of the group, and then follow up after the group ends. And anything that was redundant, I skip, even though it's on the slide. So the final stage of group is absolutely vital, it's critical, and it's just as important as every other part of the group process. It gives members an opportunity to really clarify and integrate the meaning of their experience within the group setting. So it's a reflection point in the group process. So that gives you time to really make meaning of what happened. You also get to identify any gains you've had during the group process. And I mentioned that when setting up a group, you should have goals for the group as a whole. But each member of the group can personalize their goals and see if there's anything that they gained or would have liked to gain, but they're still in progress on mastery through the group process. And then you could decide from the new behaviors that you've learned, the new skills you've acquired, how you're going to apply it in your everyday life, and a commitment to applying it in your everyday life, not just in the group, the treatment group. Now, when we talk about open groups and closed groups, you may recall that open groups, people can enter and leave the group at their own pace. Closed groups, people tend to start and end at the same point. But if you're at the final stage of group, right? So, and you personally are going to leave the group, it's critical to give adequate notice before terminating. My general rule is that you should give yourself 2 to 3 weeks for people to say goodbye. So if you are in an open group setting and you're going to leave the group, build in a transition period. That's going to allow the member themselves to adjust to no longer being part of the group, but it also allows other members of the group to say goodbye. And you know, saying goodbye is important because you've shared some laughs together, you've shared some pain together. And when it's time to say goodbye, you know, if you don't get that opportunity, it really deprives everybody the opportunity to heal and mourn that loss. Now, when we talk about saying goodbye, what it means, whether it's absolutely final or not, that's going to be culturally dependent, and each person has their own value system around what endings are. If endings are absolute, then it's very important to make sure that there are these goodbyes put into it. If the ending is, it's just temporary, or, I'll see you again, then maybe the effect of not saying goodbye is reduced. Now, you also want to, regardless of whether it's an open group or a closed group, you want to make sure that you get consolidation of learning. So if a person is going to leave the group, you might ask them, before you leave, can you identify 3 things you've learned from the group? And that's an important thing, even in the classroom, I ask that question, well, what are 3 things you got from group? right? Because it's preparing you to say goodbye. And then it allows you to review, you know, when you first started with the group, what were your goals? What did you want to accomplish? What did you accomplish? Was there any unfinished business that, you know, you're leaving the group for another reason, but there still is unfinished business? And if there's unfinished business that people need to work on, maybe you make a referral to another group or individual therapy as deemed appropriate, right? So you have to make sure that you're being fair to that individual even when they say goodbye. Now, in a closed group, so now there is no change in the group dynamic from people just coming and going throughout. You really have experienced something special together. And everybody went through the same thing, right? Because everybody started together, everybody's going to end together. So it's not uncommon to have to work through the feelings of separation. It's a good time if it's a 12-week group to ask people, well, what did you assume group therapy was like before you started, and now what do you experience it to be like now? And you can compare and contrast earlier perceptions versus later perceptions and how they might differ, right? Most people, if we go back to the mindset of people in the initial stage of group, there's a lot of misunderstandings about group. There's a lot of anxiety around group. So it's transformative. The group process itself is transformative. So you can compare and contrast earlier perceptions versus later perceptions. You could deal with any unfinished business. Now, dealing with unfinished business can be, well, what didn't you get to of your personal goals? Or dealing with unfinished business could be, is there something you really wanted to say to a member of the group that you didn't have a chance to, that now that we're ending, you would like to, right? So it's interesting, right? So sometimes people hold in their thoughts about another member of a group till the end. And it might be complimentary and it might be critical. And sometimes we ask for, you know, both constructive criticism, and we talked about how to give appropriate criticism, right? You can ask group members, say, what is your biggest concern or fear about one member of the group as they leave this group experience? Or it can be complimentary. You know, what is one thing that you've seen another person change or grow that you'd like to give them a sense of praise for? So you can ask different questions to get people dialoguing with one another. Now, people make meaning in different ways of the group experience. If we were on campus, I usually have a whole party at the end of the group with cake and everything like that. But obviously, in a virtual world, we can't do that. But you know, that's a personal gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude to all of you. And then reviewing the group process is a given in either way. Now, we oftentimes say that because closed groups tend to be more solution focused, tend to be more CBT, psychoeducational, all that stuff, we can say that this was merely practice for the real world, and it's your job to take this into the real world, carry it further. We talked about giving feedback. Now, you want to have contracts and homework for people to sign before a group. They sign a contract of the expectations of group. Each week, you typically assign homework in a closed group. If there are setbacks or issues that emerge, you it's okay to throw out the goals and objectives of that week and deal with setbacks. If a person has left the group and they have a setback, you can either bring them back to the group if it's still ongoing, or find them another group if the group has closed. Now, here, as I said, this is a time where you give people prompts to reflect on one another. So there are many ways that you could get people to talk and reflect on one another. So my greatest fear for you is whatever it is, and a person might share that. My hope for you is whatever it is. I hope that you'll seriously consider if you want to offer some guidance. I see you blocking your strengths by whatever it is. Now, we did that in group today. We talked about how does, not speaking up interfere with fully experiencing the classroom, right? So people can block their own strengths. Something that I hope you will think about doing for yourself is whatever it might be, fill in the blank. These are just examples of prompts. They're sentence completion tasks. You can say whatever comes to mind, but you'll notice it's an icebreaker activity to give people the opportunity to give parting words to one another.
To remind you that 60% of sales on Amazon come from independent sellers, Farmer Bob and his Princeton popcorn will be in this ad.
So in terms of applying lessons to everyday life, it's your job as the leader to facilitate that. It's your job to develop action plans or treatment plans as you go. So you want to make sure that happens. You want to tell people, especially if you're working with gambling or addictions or things like that, that relapses happen. So you can fall back, and similar to the values exercise we did from acceptance and commitment therapy, you can be on one ring of the dartboard and get closer to the bullseye or further away, and that does change. Growth is not a linear process. Sometimes you're moving forward, sometimes you're moving backwards. And be prepared that in the absence of group, it is possible to regress, and that's not a big deal as long as you're still committed towards moving forward. Now, when we talk about group is a means to an end. The real work happens outside of group. So the group was supposed to serve a purpose to help you get to a greater level of assertiveness, a greater level of self-disclosure, a greater level of insight, whatever it might be. The group process was meant to serve that purpose, not actually fix you or solve all your problems. You're meant to take the lessons and bring them. And in some weeks, you might have gained a lesson more than in other weeks, but over the course of group therapy, there should be pearls of wisdom that you've acquired along the way. Now, change, it can be slow, it can be subtle, it's not going to happen overnight. You want to focus on your personal growth over changing other people. If you listen to non-functional groups or non-working groups, people will point fingers at one another rather than focusing on their own change process. So you want to focus more on your change process over other people's change process. And you could do what you wish with the lessons you've learned, so you have to decide what you want to do with them. Now, evaluation is absolutely critical. You may recall in an earlier lesson I talked to you that evaluation is part of the group process, so it's part of the group experience. Because if you don't have evaluation as part of it, you have no way of knowing whether the group accomplished anything. So before you run a group, you should already have a mindset as to how you're going to assess the group experience. It's ongoing. That can happen during the process, but at the end of the group, you should have some kind of assessment process to determine whether change took place, whether growth took place. Assessment can occur in many different ways. It can occur in a formal way, or it can occur in a more informal way. Formal assessment comes with surveys, rating scales, questionnaires, and things like that. But an informal way could be more of follow-up interviews. The same way you had a pre-group meeting, you might have follow-up interviews to ask people their experience separate from the group. Now, when you're terminating, when you're moving towards termination, it's not the time to bring up new issues. Now we're consolidating, we're working towards making sense of all the experiences we've had. So do not open up issues that you won't have enough time to work. If there are issues that are unresolved, it's okay to discuss them as unfinished business and say, you know what, I would have liked for us to do A, B, C. We didn't get there. We wound up focusing on X, Y, Z. And just acknowledge what was accomplished and what was not accomplished, and that's fine. No group accomplishes everything they set out to. It's very rare for that to happen. So acknowledging it versus discussing it and trying to do a deep dive into it are two different things. You can discuss the unfinished business, but not try and work through it. You also want to ask people how they feel about ending group, right? So it could, depending on how one's group experience was, some people are going to be more okay and non-emotional about it, but other people are going to feel as though, they're going to miss something. And that's important to hear everyone's experience about unfinished business. You as group leaders or co-leaders, you help people evaluate their experience. And you want to also do an evaluation of the group leaders. So you want to assess, well, how well did we work together as group leaders? Now, you might see that the class, I meet with the group leader once or twice before they run the group. So many group leaders don't do that. And you wind up having people going in very different directions than one another. Whereas if you talk to one another and you talk about, well, what did we want to accomplish with this session, it's very easy to evaluate how well you worked together. Were you on the same page, or were you going in opposite directions? That's going to be very, very important to do. All right. Now follow. So build follow-up into your sessions. That's important. You want to have scheduled meetings for this so that you can say, okay, well, we ran the group, how did it go? Follow-up is fine. There are some group leaders who have booster groups, which is just a fancy way of saying that their group sessions are graduated from a very basic level to a more advanced level, and they build in these follow-up group sessions into a more advanced group. Or it could be just as simple as one singular follow-up session that just occurs once, right? So in this follow-up session or booster sessions, you can explore, okay, well, what has been happening in the last 3 months since group hasn't occurred? Have you had any difficulties? Have you had any regression? Any major changes since leaving the group? You could talk about feelings and thoughts that have emerged about the group experience since the assessment, because people may not share readily. So you might get that information 3 months later. You also might give them you can give them with Google Forms. It's pretty cheap and easy. You just send them a link. You can have them fill out a brief questionnaire, or you can contact them through Zoom, which is also free. Very easy technology to touch base with them at a later point. Now, members of the group are going to have to deal with separation and termination. It's very common for members of the group to feel a loss. Now, when you run a group in a graduate program, some of you will graduate and never see each other again. So it's going to be, the feelings can be compounded if it's done as an experiential group, right? So it's important to understand that as well. You also want to evaluate anything unfinished business related to group or anything else, and evaluate the impact of the group. Now, you always want to temper a group, especially a closed-ended group. If it's 10, 12 weeks of sessions, you have to scale back your expectations relative to an open group, right? So you have to understand that change takes place very slowly. It takes time, it takes practice, it takes effort. So if a person did not fully execute everything that they learned across the 3 months, that's okay. Now, a leader functions, we have to facilitate the feelings or the discussions about feelings around termination. We have to invite you with the opportunity to deal with unfinished business. You might actually give a contract or ask people to post therapy contracts that they're going to commit to something.
I still have too many jobs. I got checked on checks. Yeah, but if you're like, he's no sense. I can find you. Oh my goodness.
Now, we think that the therapy process, you have to keep confidentiality just during the group. But for the most part, you want to make sure that confidentiality is maintained even after the group is over, right? So that would be like me talking about my clients and talking about what I said after they've left therapy. There's still HIPAA involved. There's still responsibilities involved there that we might want to deal with, right? So make sure that people are not sharing other people's business after group is over. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get to exchange numbers and contact information. That's very, very common to do. So you might talk to one another. The subgrouping issue is less of a problem, but confidentiality, it remains intact. If a person has a setback, you can offer private consultations to help them move along. You can provide the follow-up group session or follow-up interviews, as I mentioned, that are separate from therapy. If a person still needs additional work, you can refer them out to a more advanced group or individual therapy as needed. And you're, as a group leader, you want to make sure that you evaluate both strengths and weaknesses. So you want a person to talk about the things that didn't go the way they wanted to. And with that, that is a very fast primer on the final aspects of group. So I'm going to stop the recording there. So it's very important that you understand that as clinicians, we are bound by an ethical code, and we are bound by legal considerations. When we say an ethical code, almost every professional association has an ethics code. For psychologists, we have something called the APA Ethics Code. And the APA Ethics Code was adopted and amended several times over, but largely we're operating based on the APA Ethics Code of 2002 with some text revisions in 2010 and 2017. And we actually are expecting another revision shortly. But in the APA Ethics Code, that will govern.
Part one,
You can just skip the line and go right to your car. And pick any car you want from Hertz's wide selection of great view.
Everything we do in terms of professional practice
Dr. Padilla.
addresses how we handle disputes. It addresses issues such as conflict of interest, power differentials, coercion issues. It addresses
Ethical and legal issues.
psychological assessment, teaching, and even psychotherapy. And the ethical standard that is most important for us are standard 10, which has to do with therapy. However, just because we have the APA Ethics Code doesn't mean that we're not bound by other ethics code. For example, the American Group Psychotherapy Association has an ethics code specifically for group therapy or group counseling. And there are specialty documents that further elucidate the APA Ethics Code. And that's what I want to impress upon you. If you only know the APA Ethics Code, you are probably not going to have the nuance that you need. So I encourage you to look at specialty documents as well from the American Psychological Association or other professional associations that are designated to address the unique issues. And in this case, the American Group Psychotherapy Association is one of the major ones. So that's just ethical code, right and wrong, judgment calls. And not everything in the ethics code is black and white. There's a lot of gray area. There are only a few areas that are absolute. For example, you do not engage in a romantic relationship with a client. Clear, right? That's black and white. Now, a former client, also clear, right? There are guidelines about what happens if you meet a former client and you hit it off. Well, I don't recommend it because you know too much about the person and you've seen them in a different way. I still don't recommend it. But the American Psychological Association says there's a 2-year moratorium. And you can't just stop seeing your client because you want to date them. It just has to take its course naturally. But notice how clear that is. It's very, very specific. Now, why do we need that? The answer is also simple because in the history of psychology, there are many people who abuse their power. When you put on a white lab coat or you call yourself doctor, that comes with power. And there's a power differential that people like Carl Jung and many other psychologists of yesteryear used and took advantage of their power, and they actually had romantic relationships with their clients. No bueno. Right? So that is very clear. But most things are gray areas in the ethics code. Which brings me to the legal issue. So we talked about ethics and ethical codes. Now, when I use the word legal, we're talking about the law. The law is a lot more concrete than ethics code. Now, granted, we wouldn't have cases going to an appellate division or the Supreme Court if every aspect of law was clear. There is still nuance in law, but law is a lot more clear. If you go to standard 1 of the APA Ethics Code, they say that if you have a debate between your ethics code and the law, you follow the law.
Temporary storage on a Macintosh.
At Papa John's, the Shakaroni is back. It's our extra biggie, ultra foamy, super pepperoni pizza. The biggest of the big, with more cheese, more pepperoni, and more shack.
Now, if the ethics code is a little more stringent than the law, you might still benefit from following your ethics code. But if the law is more stringent than your ethics code, then you certainly follow the law. So I'm just trying to give you a flavor between the difference between ethics and legal statutes. So, all right, let us begin with some learning objectives. So we'll talk about basic or major ethical issues related to group membership, the concept of informed consent, the aspect of psychological risks when being in a group, the importance of confidentiality and the role of confidentiality in groups, the role of a leader, right? In terms of their value system in group work. How do you handle conflict in value systems? Earlier in our group, we talked about there is no right or wrong, right? Each person can have their difference of opinion, difference in values, difference in perspective, and that's okay most of the time. So there are ethical ways to handle conflict in values. All right. You also want to explore ethical issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. You want to address social justice in your groups. You want to address ethical issues related to sexual orientation in groups. And just to give you another example, there are guidelines with working with individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. So we have guidelines that go beyond the basic ethics code, talking about ethical issues related to group techniques and competency and training and being culturally appropriate and relevant. We want to talk about ways that students can get direct experience by participating as members of a small group activity. For example, because this is a graduate level class, you have that experiential piece. Every week, we have a group process. That is not without ethical dilemmas. Being your professor, as well as being a contributor to the group, that is a dual relationship. Now, that doesn't mean it is forbidden. Not every dual relationship is forbidden, but there are some concerns about what you will share and what you won't share with your professor, right? You want to talk about how training and the effective training of group counselors. Every week, you'll see me jump in or demonstrate another activity. For example, today you saw me highlighting the getting to core beliefs and cognitive restructuring. So you saw that today. And each week you might learn another skill. You also have to think about legal liability and malpractice and any safeguards when practicing group therapy. So that is the lay of the land. Now, I already started to talk about this. Ethical issues pertain to standards of conduct for professional members. The APA Ethics Code does not regulate my personal life, but it does regulate my professional identity as an instructor, as a professor, and as a clinical psychologist, and as a researcher. So I am bound by these standards. And each professional organization has its own organizations and professional standards that are important to it. So I mentioned the American Psychological Association, but we're not the only one who has an ethics code. The American Counseling Association has one. The National Association for School Psychologists has another one, and it goes on and on and on. Now,
So why do so many homes in the US need a flooring replacement? The number one reason is not about planning or construction or even dust. It's just because most people don't know that they could save thousands on a flooring remodel through the